and welcome back, and thanks for watching. Have you ever taken a photograph and wished that you'd had more control over the background where you've got distracting elements and you couldn't get a shallow enough depth of field to render it out of focus? Or maybe you don't have a lens that has a wide enough maximum aperture that allows you that level of control. Well, up until now, you would have been stuck. But there's a technique we can use in Lightroom and Camera RAW that allows us to render distracting backgrounds more out of focus or completely out of focus, depending on what you want, and still keeping your main subject areas sharply defined. So how do we do it? Let's jump in and have a look. So this is a technique that applies to both Lightroom and Camera RAW, but I'm going to do this within Lightroom because it's easier for me to work this way. And this applies equally to either RAW files or processed images, and the ones I'm going to use are actually all Photoshop files, so we can use these as examples and it works either way. And what I'm going to do is show you some examples where it works really well, and I'll show you a couple of examples that demonstrate when not to use it or when it doesn't work well. So firstly, here's a photograph I took while we were in travelling in Scotland. It's not an outstanding photograph. It was taken with a 24-200 lens. Doesn't have a particularly wide maximum aperture, but the background is a little bit out of focus, and I wanted to render that even more out of focus. So how do we do it? Well, I'll start from scratch, and because this is a Photoshop file, I'm going to make a virtual copy before we go anywhere, and we'll work on that one and then we can compare it with the original. So I've now created a virtual copy, and we'll go into the develop module and we'll find the lens blur option. Now if you haven't got the later versions of Lightroom, you won't have access to this, but firstly, when you open that up, nothing happens, because firstly what we need to do is we need to click on apply, and what happens is that the image is being analysed by Lightroom and it creates what's called a depth map, where it tries to ascertain how close certain objects are to the lens, and then it can work out the focusing or the blurring of the background. Now this, depending on your computer, this may take some time. On this computer it's already processed that, and what we can do to get an idea of what it's considering to be in focus and out of focus, we can come down to this little box called Visualize Depth, and if we click that box on, you'll see here that it renders it in different colors. So the brightest yellow is what it considers most in focus, and then as it gets a little bit darker yellow and into the oranges, they're a little bit less in focus, and then the out of focus areas are rendered in blue and purple. So we can see straight away that it's analysed this image and it's worked out that this part of the image is in focus and the rest is out of focus. So from there we've got some options. Firstly, we can adjust the amount of focus, and if I crank it all the way up to 100%, it will render as much out of focus as it can, and you'll see here that these couple of leaves here were rendered partly in focus and they're still showing as being in focus, but the background, if I turn this off and back on again, you'll see that it's rendered that background quite a long way out of focus. So that gives us a pretty good idea. But what happens when certain things are just not quite the way we want them? If I turn that off again, yes, this stem was already a bit out of focus. I don't mind that staying as it is, but I really like to get rid of that. So we can have a look down here, and let's turn this Visualize Depth on again. You'll see here that this is the area that it deems in focus. If I move this slider and say, all right, well, I want more in focus, these areas are going to start to render more in white. So if I turn that off, you'll see that then some of that background is coming back into focus. So that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is bring that area of focus right back down to the range we want, but then this is still not right. So how do we solve that? Well, what we can do is we can refine the area by using a brush, and what I've got two options here. I can paint things in that I want to remain in focus, or I can paint in areas I want to take out of focus. So in this case, I want to paint in areas of blur, And of course we've got our paintbrush tool, and we can change the size of that using the square brackets keys, and then I can simply paint that out of focus, bearing in mind that I need to be fairly careful about getting onto the edges of the areas I want. Now you'll see now that that area is looking a little bit incorrect, so now if we go back and change that to paint things into focus, and by using my mouse wheel I can make that brush larger or smaller, I can just paint those areas back in, and that's looking pretty good. But I think there's an area over here that's not quite right. If I go up to the lens blur header and click on the eye tool, I can see that, I know it's done a pretty good job there of picking up the edges. I don't need to worry too much about that. So there's my before and after. Here's the image before I rendered those areas out of focus, and afterwards. And then of course we can then adjust that blur amount back to something that we find a little more acceptable. So that works really well on that image, but let's have a look at another one. So here we have another image. This time it was taken with a wide angle lens, and it was taken with a very small aperture, so that pretty much everything is sharply defined, which is fine for the vehicle, but if I wanted to create a shallow depth of field effect, it's not really going to work for me. Now I've already done the tick the box that says apply, so we don't sit and wait for that to happen again, and I've turned the blur amount down to 0. So if I put that up to about 50%, what we can do now is have a look at that visualized depth map and see what it's decided is in focus. And it's actually decided that this headlight on this side is sharply defined, and then it gradually fades away over there, and then the background is completely out of focus. So I can again control how much is going to be in focus. If I want to really bring that down to a smaller area, I can bring that slider back in. Let's turn that off and let's have a look at how that effect looks. And you can see that there's quite a lot of runoff of focus area. This foreground's a little bit still sharply defined. We could fix that with a brush, but then we've got options. I didn't discuss this previously, but we've got different types of lens blur. We can switch these around. You can get then the slightly different bokeh effects. If you can play around with these as much as you like. That's sort of like a mirror lens sort of effect, and a slightly out of shape bokeh. I think I stick with the simpler one, but you can see here this is looking pretty good, but I think I've actually brought that focus area in too far. Now I don't need to necessarily turn that visualized depth back on. I can look at this and just move the slider, and I can move that until the other side of the vehicle is now sharply defined, the foreground is sharply defined, but the background now is rendered quite a long way out of focus. So on these sorts of subjects where it's a fairly clearly defined area that's in focus, it works really well. But let's have a look at yet another example, and we'll see how that looks. And again, this is another one that I've previously clicked on the apply, so it's analyzed the image and it's worked out the depth. And you can see here, if I wanted to render that background out of focus so that I've just got this standing stone sharply defined, it's worked fairly well. But of course you need to be careful about the extent by which you render that out of focus. Now that looks totally artificial, but if we brought that back to some sort of much smaller amount, we would see that that looks quite realistic. And if I turn that off by clicking the eye symbol and turn it on, that looks quite reasonable. So there are a number of cases where this works really well, where there's a clearly defined, sharply focused area. But what happens where there's a little bit more complex subject matter? Does that work as well? Well, let's have a look now. Well, here we are. We've got now a little bit more complicated an image. We've got a mangrove here sitting in the foreground with lots of complex root structure, and a background that's also quite complex. So I've previously clicked the apply button to analyze the depth, and let's see what happens with the blur amount. So if I add that up, bring that up quite to a high amount, you'll see here that there's a bit of a problem in that it hasn't really worked out what's going on between these parts of the tree. You can see that the edges are not terribly well defined, and if I turn on the visualize depth, you'll see that yes, it hasn't really been able to define those areas so well. Now I could use my blur option and paint these areas in as blur, but that's going to be really difficult to do. And again, you've got a little bit of an issue here along the edges where it hasn't been able to define what is sharply in focus and what isn't, and it looks pretty terrible. Obviously, I've cranked that blur amount up to a very high amount, and maybe what I could do is let's just change that visualize depth and take that depth of field out a bit more, but you can still see that this bit hasn't really been rendered correctly. So when you get a more complicated subject area, the software can't quite discern what's in focus and what isn't. So in this instance, it's not going to work. And I've got another example here of a Samburu blacksmith in a village in Africa. The background's really complicated, and then I've tried to apply that, and let's just see what happens. It sort of works, but it's looking quite artificial. If we look at our depth map, yes, this foreground showing as in focus, then the bit immediately under him is not showing as in focus. We need to bring that back a bit. But there are some areas here where it's not really picking up the edges. You can see there's a few issues here, and I've tried to paint those in, but it's not really going to work. So let's turn that off, and we'll see, yes, there's a few areas, and of course this looks totally artificial because I've taken it up to a very high amount. You would have to use it very sparingly where you've got a more complicated area. Let's just turn that off and on. You really can only use a very minimal amount in these situations where there's quite a complex subject area. And of course there are other cases where it's just totally inappropriate to use this depth of field. I've got a landscape here, and what I've done is I've analysed the image and I've thrown this out of focus. Let's have a look at the depth map, and it says, well, this foreground is in focus, this is a little less in focus, and then all the rest of it is out of focus. So I can bring all those areas in, but it's not going to look realistic on a landscape area like this with areas far away in the distance. This just looks totally wrong. So you just wouldn't use it in this sort of a situation. That's totally the wrong application. So just in summary, let's go back and look at one more image, which is a macro image. Again, well, it was taken with a 300mm zoom lens on a tripod, and I've tried to isolate these little fungi, but of course what's happened is I've got a bit of an area in front and a little bit of an area behind that's in focus that's a bit distracting. So let's have a look at that color ray, that depth map, and we'll bring that up, and we can see, yes, well, it thinks all of this area in this side is more or less in focus, but the background's out of focus, but most of the rest of the fungi is okay. So in this instance I could probably fix this with a brush, use a fairly big brush, and I don't really want any of that area in focus. Let's just see how that looks, and we can just really concentrate on just the areas that we want. Let's turn off the visualize depth, and so now if I hold the I button in, this is my original image and that's my processed image. Again, I've only gone to about 40%. You just have to be mindful that if you go too far, it looks too unrealistic. So you need to keep it within the realms of reason, and we can turn that back on so we can see that it's done a pretty good job here. So this technique works really well on some photographs, and on other photographs with more complex subject matter and more detail, it's really not going to work. But it's a valuable technique for certain photographs, and it's really a good tool if you don't have a lens that will open up wide enough to give you that shallow depth of field. So I hope that's all been useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.